A little less than 50 years ago, a Stanford professor of biology and his wife published a book that predicted massive global catastrophe in the coming decades. Hundreds of millions of people would die from starvation, including tens of millions in the United States. England would cease to exist by the year 2000. India, too. The exploding population of the world would not find enough food to eat, and for those who survived, living standards would plummet. The author's solution? Mass-enforced sterility programs, government-enforced birth control, mandatory abortions and sex education, and the suspension of food aid to countries that didn't comply. The mass starvation never happened. The population growth rate is actually declining. We're saved, right? Well, maybe not.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend, the end.
Greetings, kittens, and welcome back to the podcast of Doom. Sorry for the long absence. However, I'm very glad to be back with you. Seems a lot has happened since I put down the mic in March. I've had a few terrorist incidents, particularly in France. We've also had a few mass shootings here in the United States, which is happening with a maddening frequency. Britain voted to Brexit from the European Union, and many of us are waiting with bated breath to see what happens next. We've probably been more fortunate than usual on the natural disaster front, although we have had our share of forest fires as well as a few earthquakes and tropical storms. Before we dive back into disasters and catastrophes, I wanted to devote a brief episode to our changing population. Population, of course, is a very important part of our topic, which is what happens when bad decisions affect a lot of people. Rwanda, one of the world's most crowded countries, was the location for one of the world's worst genocides. The man-eating tigress of Champawat, India, was being pushed out of her hunting grounds by an expanding population. The Great London Smog was such a big problem because it took place in one of the world's largest cities that just happened to be using low-grade coal for heating and energy on a mass scale. Countess Bathory became history's most prolific serial killer because 17th century Hungary had so many powerless peasants at the time. The bubonic plague of the 14th century happened because of expanding trade routes and a population boom taking place across Asia and Europe. And just about any wide-scale disaster will have a higher fatality count if it takes place in Eastern or Southern Asia, where our world is the most crowded. In 1968, Paul Ehrlich, a Stanford biology professor, and his wife Anne wrote a bestseller called The Population Bomb. In this book, the Ehrlichs claimed that the human population was growing far faster than the planet could support it. The near future, at that time, the 1970s and 1980s, would be filled with mass famines and wars driven by too many people fighting over too few resources. The population bomb opened with this dire warning. The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate. The Ehrlichs stated that the world population was already growing faster than the resources of the planet could support. And even if there were rapid and strong improvements in food production, there would still be mass starvation. Paul Ehrlich suggested a number of extreme measures to deal with this problem. Enforced sterility programs, government-imposed birth control, which the Chinese actually followed through on, taxes to discourage parents from having children, and a worldwide goal of zero or even negative population growth. As we know, some of these things did come true. There were cases of famine and mass starvation in Africa in the 1980s and 1990s, although nothing as dire as the Ehrlichs predicted. Food production was actually much higher than the Ehrlichs thought it would be. The Green Revolution of the late 20th century offset the pace of population growth in the world, and famines have been very rare since the 1990s. With the exception of present-day Venezuela, but that is a story for another time. Paul Ehrlich was right in predicting that the population of the Earth would double from 3.5 billion at that time to our current 7 billion sometime early in the 21st century. He's been right about pollution and fossil fuels, although some nations have done a good job cutting their pollutants and cleaning up some of their air since the population bomb was written. What the Ehrlichs may not have foreseen was actual population declines in some countries. Japan, currently the world's third largest economy, posted its first population decline since the end of World War II. The death rate there is higher than the replacement rate. The Japanese National Institute of Population and Social Security Research predicted that if the trends continue, Japan's population will fall to 50 million by 2047. Its current population is 126 million. Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics are also experiencing population declines. Bulgaria, Bosnia, Belarus, Croatia, Georgia, Ukraine, the Baltic nations, Hungary, Romania, and Serbia have all recorded population declines due mostly to birth rates falling below death rates. Most of Western Europe would also be seeing declines if immigration was not occurring in large enough numbers to offset the dropping birth rates. Some of these declines are due to immigration. For example, many ethnic Russians have repatriated to Russia from Eastern Europe and the former republics. But generally, the world has seen a decline in births unlike anything experienced in many centuries. The last time the world saw a decline in population was during the Black Death, which we examined in episode 14. Since that time, global population has been rising. During the 400 years between the end of the bubonic plague and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the world population remained mostly stable. High birth rates were offset by death due to illness, war, disasters, and an extremely high rate of infant mortality by modern standards. However, by the mid-18th century, things began to change with new advances in science and technology. Urban sanitation and waste removal improved. Water quality and access to cleaner drinking water improved. Governments began paying attention to human-caused sewage and pollution and other factors that lead to disease. Sick people with communicable diseases were getting quarantined. Vaccines and antibiotics were discovered. Worker safety laws were introduced, and child labor was discouraged or prohibited. Education played an important part in teaching people how to live healthier lives. According to a United Nations report, the world population hit the 1 billion mark in 1804. It took humanity more than 130,000 years to reach that point. 123 years later, in 1927, the population doubled to 2 billion. 33 years later, a period which included the enormous fatalities caused by World War II and the problems that immediately followed that war, the world hit the 3 billion mark. Only 14 years later, the world was at 4 billion. We are now at 7 billion people, having doubled our population since the late 1960s. But something interesting happened since the mid-1970s. The rate of population increase started to level off. That exploding line on our population chart wasn't rising as fast as it once had. What happened? There are many reasons for the decline, but perhaps the greatest reason may be a phenomenon called demographic transition. Remember how I said that throughout history birth rates have been very high, while at the same time infant mortality was very high? Well, when infant mortality started to decline during the Industrial Revolution, so did high birth rates. Most of the pre-Industrial Revolution world was involved in agriculture, and farmers need big families to pick their crops and get them to market. If infants are not surviving into childhood, farming families need to make more babies. But once infant mortality started to decline, so did the needs for farmers' wives to stay continuously pregnant. I can hear some of you cheering right now. And the Industrial Revolution meant more people were changing careers from agriculture to industry, and that also meant less of a need for huge families. As we moved from industrial-based societies to information-based and service-based societies, the need for large families shrank even further. Add to that birth control, Planned Parenting, women's liberation, and a greater acceptance of non-traditional families, and you have all the elements for population decline. But our global population isn't declining everywhere. The most noticeable thing about current population trends are how uneven the recent growth has been. The CIA Factbook keeps a record of each country's fertility rate. That is the average number of children each woman would give birth to if she lived through her childbearing years. 2.1 is the replacement number, or zero growth number. The 0.1 accounts for those children who don't make it to the child-producing years. The United States is at 2.01, or just below replacement level. The UK is at 1.9. Brazil, host of the Olympics, is at 1.79. Australia is at 1.77. Portugal, 1.52. Germany, 1.43, while Japan is at 1.4. China, with the largest population on the planet, is at 1.55. Mind you, this is just a measure of fertility. It does not account for net migration. At the bottom of the list is Singapore at 0.8. Looking for some elbow room? Try Singapore. So what countries are at the top? Try all of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Niger at 6.89 has the world's highest fertility rate. Mali, Burundi, Somalia, and Uganda round out the top 5. Angola and Zambia are in the top 10. As we move further down the list, we find more countries from South and Central Asia, Latin America, and the South Pacific, or Oceania, whichever you prefer. Clearly, there are two stories going on here. In the developed nations, and we will include China, Russia, and Brazil among them, populations are stabilizing or even dropping. In the developing world, populations are still rising, and quickly. One of the most notable effects of declining births is the rise in the median age of the population. Again, the CIA Factbook provides us with a list of every nation by median age. Who would have guessed that a spy organization could have such a wealth of information? Monaco is the oldest country in the world, with the average resident being 51.1 years old. Germany and Japan are second and third respectively. Italy and Austria are not far behind at fifth and sixth. Most of Europe can be found in the top 50. The average Spaniard is 41.6 years old, and the average Brit is 40.4. The United States and China are 63rd and 65th, with a median age around 37. Towards the bottom of the list, the nations with the youngest populations are predominantly African and Muslim-majority countries. In Saudi Arabia, the average age is 26.4 years old. In Egypt, it is 25.1. In Bangladesh, the average age is 24.3, and in Pakistan, it is 22.6. By the time you get to the youngest countries, the average person is a teenager. The typical Burundian is 17 years old. The average Malian is 16. The two youngest countries are Uganda and Niger. If you bumped into a random Nigerian, he or she would most likely be just 15 years old. And if a random Monacan bumped into a random Nigerian, they would most likely be separated by 35 years. These numbers are truly incredible, and I don't believe there's ever been a time in our history when the differences in median ages across nations was so vast. Think of some of the major events we've witnessed in the last 200 years. The Industrial Revolution, the revolutions across Europe in the middle of the 19th century, the American Civil War, the rise of manufacturing, the rise of mass consumption, World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, the turbulence of the 1960s and 1970s, and the collapse of the Iron Curtain in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Can you imagine any of these things happening if the average person at the time was 45 years old or even 35 years old? These types of events are driven by the young. In fact, so many of the major events of the last 200 years were driven by a large, restless population of young people. If you're wondering why the world economy seems to be slowing down, just look at the average age of a consumer in the developed world. It's a marketing executive's worst nightmare. What are some of the trends we can expect to see in the coming years due to the aging of the developed population versus the relative spryness of the developing nations? Guff.com put together a list. The developed economies will start to shrink. We may already be seeing that. Young people produce goods and consume goods faster than their elders. A slowdown in production and consumption means the economy will continue to contract. The general mental health of our population will deteriorate as the economy contracts. That's generally what happens during recessions and depressions. Family cohesion will suffer as the young leave their parents to find new opportunities in other cities and countries. As more young males move away from traditional nuclear or extended family roles, the older males left behind become more alienated and withdrawn. If you're looking for the causes of terrorism, you might want to focus on the role of a growing number of single young males rather than socio-economic factors. In the developed nations, a growing split is in place and it is getting wider every year. It was once called the digital divide, but it also includes other areas of science and technology. If you grew up in the 20th century, you were probably used to having a lower class, a middle class, and an upper class. That is giving way to two distinct classes, one highly educated, specialized, and always in great demand by employers. The other class is less educated, lacks specialized skills, and has great difficulty finding work. The educated elite are moving out of the countryside and into the cities where there are better economic opportunities. By raising the cost of living with their high salaries, they are forcing out the urban poor. Rural regions are becoming more economically depressed, more dependent on aid, and witnessing more of the problems associated with poverty. We may have seen some of those factors in the Brexit vote. Gender distribution in developed nations is also unequal, with more young women leaving rural areas for the cities. The remaining women often deal with hostility from the larger number of men left behind. Those left behind are also much older than those who fled to the cities, and the infrastructure to support them will be weaker because there aren't enough young people remaining to maintain important services. That puts more pressure on governments to increase welfare and other social assistance. This cycle of need and dependency will continue as more workers age out of their productive years and into retirement. The converse of the problems in the countryside is affecting the cities. Urban populations are increasing again in developed nations after decades of losses. New York City is back over 8 million people and headed toward 9 million. London is also over 8 million after dropping down into the sixes. The growth is due to a rise in high-paying jobs for people with specialized skills. That in turn leads to higher property values and rental incomes and an overall rise in the cost of living, forcing out of the cities those people who can't afford the spiraling costs, like, people on fixed incomes. Cities are denser and wealthier than ever before. As the government struggles to find and fund solutions to care for the aging population living in rural areas, those people in rural areas will become ever more disenchanted with a government that cannot provide for its citizens. Here in the United States, we are witnessing just that during the current presidential election cycle. But other nations throughout Europe, South America, and the developed Far East of Asia are also feeling the effect of rising domestic spending coupled with falling tax revenue. If you are concerned about rising threats from abroad, the demographics may back up your fears. An aging population in developed countries also means there are fewer available recruits to fill the many needs in the military, while developed countries will find a dearth of military-age men and women ready to fight. The developing nations will have a ready supply. Many of those nations where the average person is in their teens or early 20s are filled with a multitude of young, bored, unemployed men just dying to join some common cause. That may represent the most interesting dynamic playing out now. As we grow older, we get more concerned about our own individual needs and priorities, whereas the young are more likely to join together to fight for their shared interests. The world may be leaving behind the old ideological divisions and entering a new era of I's and me's versus us's and we's. Thank you for joining me today. Hopefully, I've given you some food for thought. If you use iTunes to get your podcasts and you happen to have a spare minute or two, I urge you to locate the podcast in iTunes using the search box and leave a commentary or review. Whether it be good, bad, or indifferent, every comment helps to raise awareness of this podcast. I appreciate all of your support. For our next episode, I'm choosing one of my own topics, the Children's Crusade. Seems apropos, doesn't it? Did tens of thousands of children leave their homes in 13th century Western Europe to take up the banner of the cross and fight to secure the Holy Land, or is it all just a bunch of hooey? You and me both will find out next time. I will also reveal the topics for the next 5 podcasts, which include quite a number of listener suggestions. I'm always eager to hear from you. There are so many great ideas out there. You can reach me by email at podcastofdoom@aol.com or visit the website at www.thepodcastofdoom.com. You and your friends can also visit the site on Facebook. And because I get asked this question often, you are kittens because you are small and weak in the face of great catastrophes like storms, earthquakes, plagues, wars, and revolutions. But you are also tenacious like kittens and ready to take on the greatest challenges. A trapped animal folds its ears back and straightens its tail just before it goes on the attack. So until next time, keep your ears pinned and your tail taut.